Semifinals of Chess Champions Tour 2025. Let's start with the match between Hikaru Nakamura, US Grandmaster, and Alireza Firouzja, the Grandmaster from France. Hikaru starts the game with his favorite move b3 to develop the bishop on a square b2. Alireza responds with d5, bishop b2. Alireza develops the knight on f6, developing move knight f3. Bishop goes to f5, and Hikaru immediately attacks that bishop with the move knight h4. Bishop goes back to d7, c4, knight develops to c6, exchange of the pawns on a square d5, and the knight moves back to f3. Bishop goes to f5. So Hikaru Nakamura made two moves with the knight in the opening. Alireza moved his bishop twice, actually three times already. Bishop went to f5, to d7, back to f5. Not exactly the right way to play the openings according to old rules of how to play openings, but this is the way modern players treat these positions. And Hikaru plays d3, bishop goes to g6. That's four moves by the bishop in the opening by Alireza. Knight goes to d2, e5. Firouzja controls the center, and Hikaru pieces look passive, but this is the idea of this opening. White do not get huge advantage in the beginning. They just slowly improve their position and play positional game. g3 to develop the bishop on g2, f6 just to make sure that the pawn on e5 is always supported. And just one moment here to notice that this pawn was already under attack, but if knight takes e5 in this position, knight takes e5 and bishop takes e5, after queen e7, and bishop, let's say, goes back, then there is bishop takes d3 because the pawn is pinned and black's position is much better. So therefore taking the pawn on e5 wasn't advantageous, but now f6, rook c1 goes to an open file c, a5 with some activity on the queen side of the board for Alireza, a3, not allowing any black pieces to get to a nice square of b4. Bishop develops to e7, bishop develops to g2, castle, and again knight goes to h4, putting pressure on the light square bishop, but f6 was done for a reason, because now the bishop can go to a safe square on f7. Knight goes to f5, now attacking the bishop on e7. Bishop goes to d6 and knight goes to c4. So now Hikamura's pieces are already much more active than they were like 5-6 moves ago. The knights are in nice squares, bishops are on nice diagonals. Firouzja plays a very weird looking move, rook a6, that nobody really understood, including the engines. Castle. Queen goes to d7, attacking the knight on f5. Knight takes the bishop on d6, pawn takes the knight, and d4, breaking the position in the middle. Now it's important to notice that the knight on d5 is kind of loose. It could be attacked by two pieces and defended only by the bishop. Pawn takes d4, bishop takes d4 and b5, attacking the knight on c4, but that's a losing move for black, basically a blunder, especially on grandmaster level, because Alireza didn't see the move knight b6, a great move by Nakamura. After knight b6, what we discussed is gonna be a factor. The knight on d5 is loose. And then if the knight goes away, then the knight on c6 is hanging. So now after knight b6, knight takes b6, rook takes c6, rook b8, there is a deadly pin of the knight to the rook, and black really cannot get rid of it, and therefore white's position is totally winning. After queen d3, the pawn on b5 is impossible to protect. Bishop goes to e8, rook c1, doubling the rook on the c file, d5, queen takes b5. Now white has an extra pawn, still a pin. This is another pin, two great bishops, and totally winning position. Queen goes to b7, protecting everything with all the pieces Alireza has, but rook takes b6, and queen takes d5. Now, in this position, if queen was under attack, so if bishop takes b5, then the easy win was rook takes b7, and a double attack on the king and the rook. So taking the queen was not the best continuation. Rook b6 was indeed the best move, but still, after queen takes d5, bishop takes d5, check. White has two extra pawns, an absolutely winning position. So two more exchanges and two extra pawns in rook ending, easily winning for white. Not gonna show you the rest of the game. It was a lot of moves still made in this game, but the result was clear at this moment. So let's go to game number 5 between Firouzja and Nakamura. And game number 5 was decisive game, Armageddon style of a game in which Firouzja played white and Nakamura played black, and Nakamura had to win this game in order to advance to the finals. And the game went like this: e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, two knights opening, d3, slow variation, h6, not allowing white knight or white bishop to get to g5, c3, typical idea to break in the center with eventual d4, bishop goes to c5, we have Jacobianissimo variation, slow positional game, b4 attacking the bishop, bishop goes back to e7, after queen b3 there is a battery attack on the pawn f7 that is easily protected by a castle. a4, more activity, pawn activity on the queen side of the board for Firouzja, d6, opening the bishop, castle, and knight goes to b8, positional move, with the idea to play c6 and d5. And if black would be allowed to play this, then the bishop on c4 would be trapped. Foreseeing this, Alireza plays queen a2 to remove the bishop from the attack on the square b3. Black plays c6 and bishop b3. And now a5, undermining white pawn structure on the queen side of the board. b5, developing the knight on d7, and Firouzja puts his bishop on a nice diagonal a3 f8. Nakamura puts his knight on the edge of the board to h5 in order to get to a square f4. Firouzja doesn't allow this to happen with the move g3. Knight goes to b6 for Nakamura, rook e1, and bishop h3. Kind of a weird looking move, but makes sense because white squares near the white king are weak, as the bishop is on the other side of the board. King h1. Nakamura moves his knight back to f6, possibly with some ideas of knight g4 and attacking the pawn on f2. White goes knight g1. That was the purpose of the move king h1, to put the knight on g1 and attack the bishop on h3. The bishop has to move away to g4, exchange of the pawns on c6, f4, starting some activity on the king side of the board for Firouzja. Nakamura takes the pawn, exchange of the pawns, and d5. Break in the middle, in the center of the board, makes total sense, instructive move when the opposing king is weak, and you can see that it's not protected by the pawns. So the king is weak, you need to break through in the middle of the board to open up files for the rooks, diagonals for the bishops, and Firouzja goes queen g2, exchange of the pawns on e4, and bishop e6. In this position, the best way to continue is not to exchange the bishops, but to play bishop c2, and that's what Firouzja does. Rook e8, f5, attacking the bishop on e6. The bishop goes away to a square c4. Black's position looks more active, but computer likes white mostly because these pawns are very active, and they can really go into a quick attack, but not so fast. First, need to develop the knight. Knight goes to f3. Knight goes back for Nakamura to d7. Bishop c1. Now the pawn on h6 already under attack because it's pinned. Therefore, king goes to h7, and e5 looks very dangerous because now f6 is on the way with the discovery check and winning the bishop on e7. Black, therefore, needs to move the king away from this diagonal. King h8 and rook g1, threatening the checkmate on g7. Nakamura sees this and protects the pawn on g7 with the move rook g8. Knight goes to d2. This bishop is too good to exchange, therefore Nakamura puts it on a nice diagonal on square d5, pinning the knight to the queen and the king. White knight goes to a nice square on e4 and immediately gets challenged by a black knight. Exchange of the knights. Rook e1, it was under attack, so it moved away. And a knight goes to a nice square of c4. In this position, Firouzja just develops the bishop on f4. Rook b8 with the target on b2 to go to the second rank and pin the bishop to the queen. So rook b2 is a threat. And here Firouzja plays the move queen h3, which looks very logical. He's threatening to take the pawn on h6 with the bishop, and after pawn takes bishop, queen h6, checkmate. So the move looks logical, but what Firouzja didn't see, and not many saw, an absolute brilliant move by Nakamura in this position. Queen h4, sacrificing the queen. Now the knight cannot take the queen because it's pinned. The queen can take the queen, but in that case, bishop f3, checkmate. Absolutely beautiful bishop checkmate. So after queen h4, white have no good moves. Firouzja put his king on g2, and in here queen f2, check, and this was a very easy win, but instead Nakamura just took the bishop on f4, and with an extra piece and an absolutely dominant position due to those bishops, white resigned and Nakamura advanced to the final round. His opponent in the final round was determined in the matchup between Magnus Carlsen and Indian Grandmaster Arjun Erigaisi, one of the top grandmasters in the world. Let's take a look at this game. E4, c5, we have Sicilian defense, knight f3, knight c6. Now I have to mention that in this particular game, in order to keep the match going, Erigaisi had to win. If it was a draw, then Magnus Carlsen would advance to the final immediately, but Erigaisi had to win, and looking ahead, I would tell you that he played this game at 96% accuracy, considering this is just a 10-minute game, 10 minutes per each player for the whole game. Absolutely remarkable game played by Indian Grandmaster. So knight c6, d4, exchange of the pawns, knight goes to d4 and g6. This is called accelerated dragon. Regular dragon is when the first black played d6 and then g6 and bishop g7. But if you immediately play g6 and bishop g7, that's accelerated dragon. And white, Erigaisi, decided to go with Marazzi variation, which is putting the pawns on c4 and e4 and controlling a square d5, which is a very important square in most of the openings, especially in Sicily. Bishop goes to g7, knight on d4 is under attack. Erigaisi protects it with the move bishop e3 and developing the bishop at the same time. Queen goes to b6, and now 3 black pieces are attacking the knight. The knight moves away to b3. Now, here in this position, bishop takes b2. Does not work because the queen is under attack. So therefore, first, black has to remove the queen. From the attack, queen goes to d8 and queen d2, protecting the pawn on b2. Knight f6, developing the knight, knight c3, and knight g4. Another very typical move in this type of positions of Sicilian defense. When black is allowed to play knight g4, they almost always do, attacking the bishop on e3, which is considered a good bishop in this position for white, because the light square bishop is not great. It's kind of blocked with the pawns that's standing on the white squares. So knight g4. Therefore, Erigaisi moves the bishop away to f4, d6. Carlsen opens the diagonal for light square bishop. Bishop e2, and castle, and a5. Some activity on the queen side of the board, possibly with the idea to play a4. Erigaisi attacks the knight with the move h3, Carlsen moves away to f6, bishop e3, and a4. That was the plan, attacking the knight. The knight has to go away. It goes away to center of the board to square d4. Positional game here. Exchanges of the pieces on d4. Bishop develops to d7. Rook goes to an open file d. Semi-open file d, which I should say, rook d1. And queen gets into the game with the move queen a5. Queen e3. Now here in this position, sometimes there is an interesting move, knight d5. And if black takes the queen on d2, then there is a intermediate check on e7. So knight takes e7 check, and then the next move, rook will take on d2. But in this particular case, it doesn't really work because the pawn on e4 would be under attack. But there are some ideas like that in some positions, but not in this one. Queen e3, bishop goes to a good diagonal, bishop c6, e5, attacking the knight on f6, and knight goes away to d7, at the same time opening the bishop, the black squared bishop, dark squared bishop. e6, exchange of the bishops on d4, exchange of the pawns on e6, check, and rook f7, blocking the king, and the queen did her thing on the square e6, took the pawn, and now moves back to e3. Carlsen goes rook f8, rook f1, protecting the pawn on f2, queen b6, attacking the pawn on b2, bishop goes to g4, putting some pressure on the knight on d7. More importantly, the current threat is bishop e6, pinning the rook to the king and winning the exchange. Therefore, e5, counterattack first for Carlsen, attacking the rook. Rook goes away, exchange of the queens, and knight goes to c5. Very active square c5. This position is even, but let's remember, Erigaisi, in order to advance to the next round, has to win this. So he has to play for the win. Bishop d1, putting some pressure on the pawn on a4. Carlsen moves the rook on the active square f4, attacking the pawn on c4, and b4. b4, en passant takes Carlsen, and Erigaisi takes the pawn on b3, and by doing this protects the pawn on c4. King g7, again b4, again attacking the knight goes to e4, where it's getting exchanged, pair of rooks is getting exchanged, and we have an endgame. And as we know, the endgame is where Magnus Carlsen excels. He has to be the best endgame player of all times. Maybe even better than Capablanca, although that's debatable. So to win this position for white playing against Magnus Carlsen is pretty much impossible, but Erigaisi has to try. He goes bishop e2. There would be a number of moves here that I'm gonna go quickly because it's just regular normal positional endgame game. And now the pawn on b6 is close to promotion. Pawn on e3 is very strong for black. Position still remains equal. King goes to e5. Maybe black is a little better because at the end game your king has to be active, and Magnus Carlsen king is in the middle of the board, while Erigaisi king is very passive on the square e1. Check from a5. King goes even further on the board, f4. Rook d5, attacking the pawn on d6. Magnus surrenders that pawn and allows Erigaisi to take it, but instead he goes on attack, occupying open file A. And after bishop d1, rook goes to a2, and it looks pretty scary for white because the pawn on g2 is under attack, and after that falls, the pawn on h3 will fall as well. Erigaisi therefore has to play g4, and after bishop goes to b1, which was one of the only moves that the bishop had in this position, c5, and now white is already better because they have two passing pawns, and one of them can queen soon. Rook h2, creating some checkmate ideas, although that's still not a checkmate because there is still king e2. Bishop goes to e2, check, and Erigaisi blocks his king with the move bishop f1. King takes f3. And now what's interesting here, that this position is totally winning for white. Indian Grandmaster had the win here. It's not that easy, but the winning combination started with the move rook f6 check. King would go to e4 and c6. And the pawn will queen. So that was winning. Unfortunately for India, Erigaisi didn't find it. He did play rook f6, but after king g3 and c6, And that's all correct. Magnus played bishop d3, and in this position, after c takes b7, Magnus resigned because there is no checkmate, everything is protected, and next move, b8 queen. So Erigaisi won the game he had to win, again playing with 96% accuracy. And because he won this game, another game had to be played between those two players. Erigaisi was playing white, Carlsen was playing black again. And this was game number 5, Armageddon style, and Erigaisi again had to win. Play d4, c5, we have another Sicilian defense. Now Magnus Carlsen plays another variation of Sicilian defense with the move e6. Erigaisi plays, I should say passively, d3, because normally here white plays d4. Knight develops to c6, g3, the bishop will go to g2, d5, queen e2. It doesn't matter that the queen kind of occupies the square that usually belongs to the bishop, because the bishop will be developed to g2. Carlsen develops his bishop on e7, bishop g2, knight goes to f6, castle, and b6, so the bishop can go to b7 or a6, developing e5, immediately putting pressure on black position and attacking the knight goes back, c4, undermining black pawn center, and d4, and now the bishop, light square bishop, becomes very, very strong piece for white. h4, immediately starting attacking on the king side of the board. Bishop goes to b7, developing, rook goes to e1, queen c7. There is some pressure on the pawn e5. 3 attackers, so far 3 defenders, but still another defender is on the way with bishop f4, h6, prophylactical move. In the future, the king after the castle would be able to move to h7 and not allowing any of the white pieces to immediately go to g5. Erigaisi develops the knight on d2, and Carlsen castles long side, because if he castled short side, the attack here would be pretty devastating for him. So long side castle makes sense. Knight goes to a very nice square on e4 with the idea to go to even better square on d6. And here Magnus decides to take the pawn on e5, calculating all the variations here because there are so many exchanges on the way. Knight takes e5, knight takes e5, and knight takes c5 for Erigaisi, using the fact that after knight moves away, then black knight on e5 is under attack by 3 white pieces. So after knight takes e5, bishop has to take on g2. Again, pretty complicated variation. Bishop takes g2 is the only move, the only good move for black here. They have to be really careful, because if they just took the knight on c5 after bishop takes e5 attacking the queen, white's position would have been absolutely dominant. So it was important to take the bishop first on g2. Bishop takes e5 attacking the queen. The queen takes the knight on c5 and king takes g2. So after all this mayhem in the middle of the board, we have a position where the material is even, but white position is a lot more pleasant and easier to play. mostly because the king is not safe. The black king is not safe, and some ideas of a3, b4, c5, and opening the files for the rooks could be very dangerous for Carlsen. So f6 attacking the bishop for Carlsen. The bishop moves away to an only available square f4. Queen c6 check, king h2, and g5. Smart move. You cannot take the pawn now on h5 with the pawn, because after exchange of the pawns there is a check. And the next move, and the white will lose the bishop. Erigaisi obviously notices that and moves the bishop back to d2. e5, h5, blocking any possibility of Carlsen attack on the king side, blocking all the breaks. Rook therefore goes to e8. It has nothing to do on h-file anymore. And b4, starting attack on the queen side of the board, again using a very uneasy position of the black king. King goes to b8, a4. All makes sense. White's position is becoming more and more dangerous. White attack, I should say, becoming more and more dangerous. Bishop d6, b5, attacking the queen. Queen moves away to b7 and a5. Expected move. Again, need to open files for the rooks. Carlsen counterattacks on the king side of the board. Anytime the castles are done on different sides of the board, we always have a very nice, very interesting active game with white attacking on the queen side, black attacking on the king side. So who is first? After f5, exchange of the pawns on b6, rook gets to a6, king goes to c7. That's a mistake. And that's a mistake because after rook a1, white's position is winning. The threat is rook a7 to pin and trap the king, the queen. So the only move for black is rook a8. And here c5 was not the best continuation. The best continuation was a little more difficult move, but with the same idea. The move that was winning the game was bishop b4, sacrificing the bishop, and the idea is to deflect that bishop from protecting the pawn on e5. Let's take a look at the variation. Bishop takes b4, rook takes a8, rook takes a8, and here queen a5. And after queen a5, white's position, although without a piece, is absolutely winning. Let's say king d7 to continue this variation. Another pawn is falling. King d8. And after queen f6, king e8. And pretty much many moves win here. White can play rook a8 and even win this position, but the best way to win for white after king e8 would be c5. And actually sacrifice another rook on a1, queen h8 check, king d7, and c6. So that was the variation that was winning the game and the match for Erigaisi. Unfortunately for him, he didn't see it. He played instead the move c5 with the same idea to deflect the bishop. But this doesn't work as well, because b takes c5, and after b6 check, king escaped to a square c6. This is still much better for white, but not so easily winning as before. Rook a7, attacking the queen. Exchange of the rooks on a7. Pawn on a7 is one square away from promotion. King d7, presenting white with another opportunity to win the game, but this was not possible to find in 6 minutes for a human, I guess, because the winning move was bishop takes g5. And after h takes g5, again, sacrificing a piece, and the pawn h6 would be going to promote to the queen, supporting by the queen, and black cannot contain both passing pawns. So that was a winning continuation, very difficult to find, obviously. Queen d1, played by Erigaisi. This position is already a draw. Rook a8, queen a4 check, king e6, another check. Queen goes to d5, cannot exchange the queens, obviously, because white is without a pawn and would be a losing endgame. Queen a6, e4, and now black's position is looking very promising already, with all those pawns starting to march towards the white king. Rook goes to e1, pinning this pawn to the king. Therefore, king goes away to d7. Rook b1, occupying the b file. Carlsen goes e3. The best continuation for white was checking the king on b7 with the rook. Erigaisi played more passively with bishop e1, f4. Now this is already really looking dangerous for white. Bishop b7 check. I'm sorry, rook b7 check. Bishop blocks the check with the move bishop c7. Bishop goes to a5, and here it turns out that the bishop on c7 is pinned, attacked twice, and there is only one plan for black to save this game, but Carlsen finds it, and it's to exchange the pawns on g3 and then start checking the white king. Queen a2 check, king h1, queen a1 check, king g2, queen a2 check, king h1, queen a1 check, king g2, another check, and the position was repeated 3 times. And this is a draw. And by drawing this game, Magnus Carlsen advanced to the final round. To play against Nakamura. Now, Erigaisi couldn't escape the draw here, because if he moved his, after the check, if he moved his king on f3, let's say, then he would get checkmated from starting with the move rook f8 check, and all black pieces are participating in checkmating the white king. So after king g4, queen e2 as variation, king h3, queen f1 check, and queen f5 checkmate. So finals between Nakamura and Carlsen. And in the very first game, Carlsen plays with 94% accuracy, showing who is who in the world stage of chess. d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop c4, we have bishop f4, we have again London Jabava, the opening that Carlsen started to play quite a bit. a6, e3, to let the light square bishop in the game, h6, h4, e6, knight f3. Those are all theoretical developing moves. b6, to put the bishop on b7. Knight goes to the middle of the board on e5. Knight d7, immediately challenging that knight. Queen goes to f3. In some combinations, there could be checkmate on f7. So immediately Nakamura gets rid of that strong knight on e5, exchanging the knights, and involves another knight to attack white pieces. Carlsen moves the bishop away to f4 and c5, trying to undermine white center. Queen g3, and now it's not so easy to develop the black square bishop, because if it goes to e7, the pawn on g7 is hanging. Bishop develops to b7, a long castle. Rook c8, immediately kind of x-raying the white king, and e4. Carlsen opens up the game in the middle of the board using the fact that the black king is in the middle of the board, which is not safe. Exchange of the pawns. Now this is an important take because after Nakamura took the pawn on d4, white cannot take. They can take the pawn on d4 with the rook, but their position will not be so good after the move queen f6. So therefore, temporarily sacrifice of the knight on c3, and you cannot take the knight on c3 because after d takes e6, check and checkmate. So that could have been the end of the game. Nakamura obviously sees all this, doesn't take the knight on c3, and plays knight f6. Carlsen continues to sacrifice his knight, takes the pawn on e6, and knight goes to h5. Nakamura attacks both the queen and the bishop. Queen goes away to g4, exchange. Nakamura takes the bishop on f4, check with the pawn on f7, king takes f7, and we can see that in this position, white is considerably better, because first of all, they have an extra pawn, and most importantly, black king, Nakamura king, is in the middle of the board, absolutely not safe, not protected by any pawns, any pieces, and white's position is totally dominant. So after queen f4 check, queen f6, rook takes d4, and now white has two extra pawns. Exchange of the queens, and we have an endgame with Magnus Carlsen having two extra pawns. We're not gonna even look at the end of this game because Magnus Carlsen can win this endgame even without one extra pawn, but with two he can do it with closed eyes, really. And he did win this game. The second game ended in a draw, and now the third game. Carlsen plays white again, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. So now he chooses Ruy Lopez, very positional opening, understanding that the draw will be in his favor, and Nakamura really has to win this one. Knight e7, knight c3, all developing moves, knight g6, d4, exchanging the pawns on d4, knight takes on d4, queen takes d4. The queen is in a very good central square. White's position is much more pleasant. c6, attacking the bishop. The bishop simply goes away to e2. Nakamura develops the queen to b6, offering exchange of the queens. And Carlsen declines this offer, although normally I would say that he would take on b6 and play the endgame, his favorite, but here he decides to play more aggressively. After bishop e7, he goes immediately a4 with the idea to play a5. Therefore, Nakamura blocks that attempt, playing a5 himself. Castle, castle, bishop e3, attacking the queen. Queen could go away, but Nakamura decides to block it with the bishop and exchange the bishops on c5. And Carlsen plays rook d1, putting the rook on an open file d. Knight goes to e5, middle of the board, attacking the queen. The queen goes to d6, and now Carlsen actually already offers exchange of the queens in a very good position for him because the file d belongs to his rook. The bishop on c8 is absolutely sad-looking piece, surrounded by the pawns of the same color. f6, f4. Now the knight, the only nice looking piece of black position, has to move back also and goes back to f7, and bishop c4, pinning the knight to the king. Black's position is absolutely devastated. King goes to h8, rook moves back, b6. It's not easy to develop the bishop because the pawn on d7 would be hanging. e5, putting more pressure on black position. Knight goes to h6. The knight moves to center of the board on e4, possibly going to d4, possibly putting pressure on the pawn on f6. Knight f5 attacking the rook, rook goes back to d3, and d5, sacrificing the pawn because otherwise it would be a slow death. For Nakamura, he had to do something, so he had to sacrifice the pawn en passant, bishop d7, rook e1, rook e8, and the king goes to the middle of the board, and it should go in the endgames. g5, and here Carlsen actually made a mistake, moving his rook to b3, which seems like a logical move, attacking the pawn on b6. Wasn't the best continuation, as after g takes f4 and rook takes b6, knight goes to a nice square in d3, and black's position is not so bad right now. Attacking the bishop, bishop goes back, check on g4, kings go to f3, f5, attacking the knight on e4, and the knight goes to c5, sacrificing the rook on e1. Nakamura takes that rook, knight takes d7, now Carlsen plays without an exchange, but the pawn on d6 is too strong. Rook d8 attacking the knight, rook b8, cannot take the rook because after rook takes b8, knight takes b8, the pawn will queen. Good move for Nakamura, rook e8, exchange of the rooks. Bishop takes f5. Knight is under attack, so it goes to h6. And king takes pawn on f4. Now, if black takes the bishop on f5, after this moves, the pawn again will queen, because the rook by itself, without the king, cannot stop the white pawn and white king. Therefore, knight goes to f7, knight e5, knight takes d6. This position is actually looking more like a draw already. Even after knight c6, rook f8, knight d4, king g8, b3, so a lot of positional moves. Nakamura gives up another pawn on h7, that wasn't necessary really, so now white have 4 pawns for the exchange. Rook h8, attacking the bishop, counter-attacking the knight with the move knight king e5. The knight goes away, bishop attacks it again, check. King moves away to f4, knight c5 attacking the bishop. The bishop moves away to f3, rook d8 attacking the knight. The king protects the knight, another check, king goes to d2, the pin of the knight. King goes to c3, rook c8, and after knight c6, the pawn on a5 cannot be protected really. So king f6, another attack on the knight, knight goes away, king goes to b5, rook g8, and knight takes a5. Totally winning position for white, check. And here, actually, Nakamura takes the knight, which is protected by the rook, and now he has an extra rook. I don't know if it was a blunder by Carlsen or he wanted to play this position. It's still winning because he has 5 extra pawns. Very unusual material combination. g4, knight, rook e5, h4, king g7. I'm going quickly here because what happens in this position, the reason it's totally lost, the knight, the black knight has no moves. Therefore, although it is present on the board, it has no role, and therefore the threat was b4. Attacking that knight, the knight would have no moves, so Nakamura decides to sacrifice it for the pawn, because otherwise he would lose it immediately, and after rook e4, the move he made himself, he decided to resign, as there is no stopping for of the pawn A to promote. And that's how Carlsen won the match with Nakamura, advanced to the finals, to grand final, and his opponent will be determined tomorrow.
I think Hikaru had a very tough emotional match against Alireza, so I think he was not quite able to readjust.
I wanted to show you a game between Nepomniachtchi and Artemiev, two Russian grandmasters who played in the bottom brackets of the tournament. And again, one player from the bottom brackets of the tournament could still get into the grand finals and play with Carlsen for the title. In this particular position, it was a decisive game between those two. Nepomniachtchi is playing white, Artemiev is playing black. Nepomniachtchi is totally winning because there is no way to stop this pawn from promoting. Artemiev checks queen c8, d7, queen goes to a6 check, and here Nepomniachtchi played the move king e7. In this position with 9 seconds to go, Artemiev didn't notice that after queen f6, king e8, queen f8, checkmate. So he could checkmate Nepomniachtchi in 2 moves and win the game. Instead, he didn't see it, played queen a3, and after a series of checks, there was a second queen on the board. Nepomniachtchi won the game and remained in the tournament, and Artemiev is out. So let's take a look at what happened today. Magnus Carlsen beat Erigaisi. Hikaru Nakamura beat Alireza Firouzja. Then in the finals, Carlsen beat Nakamura 2.5 to 1/2 and advanced to grand final. In the losers bracket, I don't like the name losers bracket, but that's how it's called. Erigaisi will play a match with Nepomniachtchi tomorrow. Alireza Firouzja will play with Polish Grandmaster Jan Krzysztof Duda. The winners of those two matches will play each other, and the winner of that match will play Magnus Carlsen in the grand final of Chess Champions Tour 2025. See you tomorrow.